What interests me is this phenomenon that occurs when our society gets more prosperous.
Mm-hmm.
Our ambitions and our self-image and our perception of our self-worth gets higher,
Mm-hmm.
and what we deserve, we think gets greater and greater.
Mm-hmm.
Yet the stack of proof pointing towards us deserving that thing gets less.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's weird how that happens.
So like as our we have these sort of rising standards, but our willingness to kind of meet them is not, sort of rising in turn. You think?
And not only not rising, but it declines.
Right.
So you get this kind of paralysis where guys are locking themselves away in their bedrooms and doom scrolling on TikTok.
Mm-hmm.
But because I don't know if it's a material thing or if it's a social thing, but this comfort that they have, it means that they think they deserve more.
Oh, interesting.
Yet they're not putting out the proof that they deserve it, so they get disenfranchised and spiral even further down.
Yeah. I guess there's there's maybe a story you could tell where if you live in historically unprecedented levels of comfort, right? Like even if you're just an ordinary middle class guy, again, like the type of guy living with your parents, that level of comfort is still historically unprecedented. And so maybe there's something here where you are living like a wealthy person and, some part of you believes that, there are only certain types of jobs given your wealth and your status and your comfort that you can work given how comfortable you already are versus, if you're like living in a hovel and you're barely scraping by, you're more willing to take on jobs that, our generations past might have taken, something like that. If you were living kind of on the margins of society and say something like the 1930s, you would take any job that came your way. Whereas now, if you're living comfortably with your parents and, a fast food job opens up, you're not gonna have that same level of drive to apply for it.
I wonder how this varies across cultures. If you take something somewhere like the UK, where there's a more social, kind of a rigid social structure of class, you're this class, you're that class, stay in your lane. I wonder if you'd see more and more men in that middle class being disenfranchised because they think, I'm not one of those peasants. I'm at this level and I deserve nothing less.
Yeah. I mean, I think like it probably does vary across cultures. I imagine something like that happens in the US too. Our class system is less rigid, but it still exists. And, one marker is level of education, for example. So if you're a 23-year-old guy with a bachelor's degree and you're, running into brick walls, you're not having any luck getting a white collar job that you thought you would get given your level of education. Very few, I think, of those types of guys would work in a more sort of blue-collar, menial role for, even if the pay was the same, but if the status is not commensurate with what they believe they deserve, then they would be less willing to work at it. So, it's one of these sort of strange paradoxes, I think, of affluence and abundance. And, I've visited developing poor societies outside of the Western world, and their approach to work is just completely different. Far less kind of pride and less like bitterness and resentment. And I think that's in part because you really don't have time or sort of mental space to devote to resentment when you literally have to work these jobs to survive and provide for your family. Whereas, in richer countries, you have a bit more time to dwell on your own misfortunes or perceived misfortunes.
Yeah, I recently came back from being in South Africa for a month. I was on holiday over there and I spent a lot of time in the lovely, luxurious parts of Cape Town because if you've got a Western income in South Africa, then you're absolutely balling. I made sure to not just stay in that bubble and think, oh, this is South Africa. How wonderful. So I went out and visited the townships there. And suddenly all of these culture wars going on in the West, and even just scrolling on Apple News whilst I was there and I got back from this Uber to the townships, it all seems pretty trivial.
Yeah, it's hard to once you sort of step outside of your familiar scenery, your familiar environment, and you witness disrepair and people who are like struggling and scraping by, all of our political skirmishes and everything, they just seem very unserious.
I don't want to dwell on it for too long because I'm very conscious of not speaking to people about things they've spoken about a million times. But
sure.
Your concept of luxury beliefs, I think we have to talk about it at least briefly.
Sure.
It's so valuable, especially when I want to target this podcast towards Gen Z. It's one of the most game-changing concepts I've learned about. So let's talk about it.
Sure. Well, I developed this framework, luxury beliefs, ideas and opinions that confer status on the affluent while often inflicting costs on the less fortunate members of society. And a core feature of a luxury belief is that the believer is sheltered from the consequences of his or her belief. And we can get into specific examples, and there are different kinds of frameworks to understand this idea. But for me, it starts with Thorstein Veblen. If you read this book, The Theory of the Leisure Class from 1899, Veblen was an economist, and he wrote about how the elites at the turn of the 20th century exhibited their status with material goods, with luxury goods, these expensive material possessions. So back then it was tuxedos and evening gowns and top hats and monocles, pocket watches. And that's how the elites showed their social rank. And you can fast forward to the mid-20th century, and there was a sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, who wrote a book called To Distinction, A Social Critique of the Judgment of Taste. And in this book, Bourdieu writes about cultural capital, about how elites will convert their economic capital into social capital. So, you can do this by spending money and attending expensive private boarding schools, for example, and thereby over time, being in these types of environments, you learn how to use certain kinds of vocabulary, hold certain opinions, develop certain habits and tastes, learn how to talk about intricate and arcane topics like, vintage wines and art and exotic locations and all of this knowledge. The subtext is I went to an expensive school and I spend a lot of time in rarefied social circles, and that's why I know all of this information. So if you fast forward to today, my claim is that luxury beliefs are the latest expression of cultural capital. And there are, example after example, I go into how people with college degrees who earn lots of money hold very different opinions on average than sort of the typical middle or working class member of society. And this idea started to take shape in my mind, once I, went off to college. I'd mentioned I was in the military before. I had a very different background than a lot of my peers, and I went off to Yale for undergrad, and started to hear strange opinions and ideas that I had never heard of before, around family formation, around law enforcement, around drug use, around, using addictive technologies. There are a lot of people who became very wealthy by promoting addictive technologies, but then when you look at themselves in their own private lives, they are very careful about screen use and, hiring nannies to monitor their children's use of tablets and iPhones and so on. Steve Jobs famously wouldn't let his kids use an iPad. I don't know if did you watch the latest season of Black Mirror?
No.
Okay. So in one of the most recent episodes of the latest season of Black Mirror, there's a tech CEO who developed this like VR video game thing. And there's this funny sort of, scene in there where one of his employees is like, he has to use the video game himself for reasons of the plot. The CEO is like, you have to use the game and get into this other VR world. And he was like, well, how do I do it? And they're like, you've never used your own game before? And he's like, no, I wouldn't use this thing. I read. And so the joke here is like this tech CEO is like selling this extremely potentially dangerous addictive technology, but he's like, he reads. He's not going to use this thing that he's getting rich off of. But you could see this logic applied to, like defunding the police. A lot of people who supported this movement, defunding the police, if you look at the zip codes that they live in, gated communities, low crime areas, people at there were these reports in 2020 and 2021 of the same neighborhoods where you heard these slogans. They were also hiring off-duty police officers to patrol their neighborhoods, basically doing everything they could to shield themselves from the chaos and the fallout in the wake of all of the sort of demonstrations that year. And so this luxury beliefs idea seems to have taken off. I'm surprised at how many people are resonating with it, but it's a useful way, I think, to understand how people are expressing their social rank, their education, their sort of interest in newfangled, sophisticated ideas in an attempt to distinguish themselves from the masses. So, people used to say, I'm an affluent, educated, sophisticated person. Look at my fur coat. And today they do it by saying, I'm an educated, affluent, sophisticated person. Let's defund the police.